You cannot possibly be serious, the Duke of Silverbrook said. He stood in his mother's drawing room, still wearing his travelling coat, having ridden directly from his estate the moment her letter reached him, and the Dowager Duchess regarded him with the particular serenity of a woman who had expected precisely this reaction, and found it entirely unremarkable. "I'm quite serious, Nathaniel," she said. "You are engaged. The announcement appeared in the Morning Post 3 days ago. Half of London has already sent their congratulations." "To whom exactly am I engaged?" "Miss Eugenia Wexford, daughter of Lord Wexford, whose finances, I am told, are in considerable disarray." "I have never met the woman." "You will meet her this afternoon," his mother said, entirely unbothered. "I find that detail rather easily corrected." Miss Eugenia Wexford had spent the morning being informed by her own mother of an engagement she had not agreed to a man she had never seen, and arrived at Silverbrook House with the particular composure of a woman determined not to faint in front of strangers, whatever the provocation. "Lady Eugenia," the Dowager Duchess said, rising to greet her with genuine warmth. "Thank you for coming so promptly." "I was not entirely given a choice, Your Grace," Eugenia said. "My mother informed me I was engaged to your son over breakfast, as though commenting on the weather." "Yes, I imagine that was rather a shock." "It was considerably more than a shock." The drawing-room door opened, and the Duke of Silverbrook entered, still in his travelling coat, his expression composed in the particular way of a man holding his temper through sheer force of will. "Lady Eugenia," he said with a stiff bow, "I understand we are engaged." "So I have been told, Your Grace." "Did you agree to this arrangement?" "Did you?" Eugenia returned. Something flickered across his face. Not quite amusement, though close enough that Eugenia noted it. "No," he said. "My mother appears to have engaged me without consulting me at all." "Then we have at least one thing in common," Eugenia said. "Equal surprise." "This is a disaster," Eugenia said, the moment the Duke's mother left them alone under the thin pretext of arranging refreshments. "I agree entirely," the Duke said. "Might I ask how my mother became acquainted with your situation specifically?" "Lady Hartworth, I imagine. She is a friend of my mother's and has been searching for ways to assist us since my father's investments collapsed last winter." Eugenia's jaw tightened. "I did not ask for charity, Your Grace, and I certainly did not ask to be engaged to a stranger as a means of providing it." "Nor did I ask to provide it," he said, "though I find I am curious about the scale of the difficulty if we are to discuss undoing this arrangement sensibly. My father owes considerably more than our estate is worth," Eugenia said, the admission costing her visibly. "We have perhaps 6 months before the creditors take everything that is not entailed. I had resigned myself to marrying whoever would have me, regardless of affection, simply to keep my mother and younger sisters from the workhouse." The Duke was quiet for a long moment. "That is not charity," he said finally. "That is desperation, which is an entirely different matter and deserves to be addressed plainly rather than romanticized by my mother into a society announcement." "I do not require your pity, Your Grace." "I am not offering pity," he said. "I am offering an observation. We are both, it seems, victims of my mother's particular talent for unsolicited intervention. I propose we discuss this as the practical matter it actually is, rather than the romance she has decided it should resemble." The arrangement, once discussed plainly, proved considerably more workable than either of them had expected. 3 months, the Duke said. A public engagement, sufficient to discourage your creditors and satisfy my mother's announcement, after which we will quietly determine we do not suit and part amicably. In the meantime, I will settle your father's most pressing debts, which should buy your family considerably more security than 6 months. That is generous. It is practical, he corrected. An engagement that ends in apparent mutual disinterest causes no scandal. One that ends abruptly, immediately after my mother's announcement, causes considerable scandal which I would prefer to avoid. There is a condition I must insist upon, Eugenia said. I will not be paraded about as though performing for an audience. If we do this, I require honesty between us, whatever else we pretend for everyone else. That, the Duke said, is the first condition anyone has proposed to me that I find no objection to whatsoever. There is a second condition, Eugenia added. Given the appearance this must maintain, I understand I'm expected to be seen with you with some regularity. I would prefer that regularity occur somewhere other than my mother's cramped townhouse, given the current state of our household. You may stay here, the Duke said, with my mother as chaperone, for the duration of the arrangement. It will make the pretense considerably more convincing and considerably easier to manage. That is highly irregular. So is everything else about this morning, he said. I find I've stopped expecting regularity from it. The first week of cohabitation established a rhythm neither of them had anticipated. You read at breakfast, the Duke observed, the third morning, finding Eugenia at the table with a newspaper rather than the customary idle conversation he had expected from a society fiancé. I have always read at breakfast, Eugenia said, not looking up. My father considered it unbecoming. I considered his objection unconvincing. I find I have no objection at all, he said, settling across from her with his own paper. Though I confess I am curious what you make of the trade tariffs currently under debate. I think the proposal favors landed interests considerably more than it favors anyone who actually produces goods, Eugenia said, which seems a poor foundation for legislation claiming to benefit the nation broadly. The Duke looked up from his own paper, genuinely surprised. That is precisely the argument I made in the Lords last month. Then the Lords were fortunate to have you, Eugenia said, since I understand most of your colleagues believe trade policy begins and ends with their own rents. He laughed, a short, surprised sound, and Eugenia found herself unexpectedly pleased by it. He has not laughed like that in this house in years, the Dowager Duchess informed her own sister, Lady Hartworth, over tea, with the particular satisfaction of a woman whose scheme was proceeding exactly as intended. I'd nearly forgotten the sound. You take a great deal of credit for an arrangement built on financial desperation, Lady Hartworth observed. I take credit for recognizing an opportunity, the Dowager said. Eugenia Wexford is the most sensible young woman I've encountered in a decade, and my son has spent that entire decade avoiding sensible women in favor of ones who flatter him without challenging him in the slightest. I simply remove the opportunity for him to avoid her. That is manipulation, Augusta. It is matchmaking, the Dowager said. I am merely more direct about my methods than you are. You play the pianoforte rather well, Eugenia observed one evening, finding Nathaniel at the instrument while the household otherwise settled for the night. My mother insisted, he said, not stopping. She believed every gentleman should possess one accomplishment beyond Parliament and estate management. "I cannot play at all," Eugenia admitted. "My father considered the lessons an unnecessary expense once his investments began failing, and I confess I did not protest the loss very strongly. I have never had much patience for accomplishments that serve no practical purpose." "Music serves a purpose," Nathaniel said. "It simply is not always an obvious one." "Convince me, then." He finished the piece and turned to face her fully on the bench. "It requires nothing of you," he said. "No ledger to balance, no household to manage, no family situation to solve through clever arithmetic. For a few minutes it asks only that you listen." Eugenia considered this. "I am not certain I know how to do nothing, Your Grace. I've spent considerably too long managing crises to remember what idleness feels like." "Then perhaps," he said, "this arrangement might teach you that as well. Alongside everything else, it appears to be teaching us both." "You should know," the Duke said, 3 weeks into the arrangement, finding Eugenia in the library with a stack of his estate ledgers she had, without asking, begun reviewing, "that my mother is rather pleased with herself." "I have noticed," Eugenia said, not looking up from the columns of figures. "Your steward has made an error here, incidentally. The tenant rents for the eastern farms have been calculated against last year's harvest rather than this year's, which is considerably worse." The Duke crossed the room to look over her shoulder. "You are reviewing my estate accounts." "You left them open on the desk," Eugenia said. "I find I cannot resist a column of figures that does not balance properly. It is a flaw, I am told." "It is not a flaw," he said. "It is, in fact, precisely the sort of attention to detail my actual steward apparently lacks. How did you learn to read accounts this thoroughly?" "Necessity," Eugenia said. "Someone had to understand precisely how badly my father had ruined us. I taught myself rather than remain ignorant of my own family's collapse." "That sounds like rather a heavy education for a young woman." "It was considerably more useful than embroidery," Eugenia said, "which I was also taught and remain entirely hopeless at." They walked the gardens at Silverbrook the following Sunday, the Dowager Duchess trailing a discreet distance behind with a book she was not reading. "Tell me about your father," Nathaniel said. "Not the debt specifically, the man himself before all of this." Eugenia considered the request, surprised by it. "He was generous to a fault," she said finally. "He believed every investment would be the one that finally secured our family's future, and he believed it with such conviction that it took years for any of us to recognize the pattern. I do not think he meant to ruin us. I think he simply never learned to recognize a bad wager from a good one, and by the time the rest of us understood that, there was very little left to salvage." "That sounds painful to watch." "It was," Eugenia admitted. "I spent 2 years watching a man I loved dismantle everything he had inherited, entirely convinced each time that this particular scheme would be different. I learned to read ledgers so that I would never again be the last person in a room to understand how badly things had gone." "I'm sorry," Nathaniel said quietly. "That is rather a heavy thing to have learned so young." "It has made me considerably more useful than most young women of my acquaintance," Eugenia said. "I've decided to think of it as a fair trade, even on the days I do not entirely believe that." They walked in silence for a moment, and Nathaniel found, to his own quiet surprise, that he wanted very much to keep walking beside her, regardless of what the next 3 months actually required of either of them. You have not once asked me what I want from this marriage when it eventually becomes real to everyone else, Eugenia observed several days later, finding Nathaniel in his study reviewing correspondence from his solicitor regarding her father's debts. I assumed security was sufficient, he said. I did not think to ask for more. Security is necessary, Eugenia said. It is not sufficient. I spent my entire childhood watching my mother manage a household on whatever scraps my father's schemes left behind, and I promised myself, rather young, that if I ever married, I would want to be asked what I thought about things, not simply provided for. What do you think about things, then? Nathaniel asked, setting aside his correspondence entirely. I think the factory reform bill you support does not go nearly far enough, Eugenia said, and I think your mother is considerably more clever than either of us has given her credit for, and I think I've stopped minding this arrangement nearly as much as I expected to when it began. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. I've stopped minding it considerably more than that, he said. We need to be careful, the Duke said one evening, as their carriage returned from a dinner where they had spent the better part of 3 hours in increasingly easy conversation, ignoring half the other guests entirely. Careful of what? Of forgetting that this is not real, he said. It would be remarkably easy to confuse the performance with something else entirely. Eugenia's heart gave an odd, unwelcome thump. I am not confused. Neither am I, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise even to his own ear. I am simply establishing clarity. Neither of them spoke for the remainder of the carriage ride home, and Eugenia spent that silence privately, uncomfortably aware that clarity was precisely the thing she had stopped possessing somewhere around the 2nd week. Lady Priscilla Faulkner arrived at the Hartington musical on the arm of her current admirer, took one look across the room at Nathaniel and Eugenia, standing together near the pianoforte, and altered her course immediately. Lady Eugenia, she said, sweeping toward them with a smile considerably sharper than it was warm. How interesting this engagement. Nathaniel and I were very nearly betrothed ourselves, you understand, before circumstances intervened. I do hope you have considered what a man of his position actually requires in a wife. Connections, fortune, Polish suitable to his rank. Her eyes traveled deliberately over Eugenia's gown, 2 seasons old and carefully maintained. I should hate for you to discover, too late, that you are simply a convenient solution to an inconvenient family situation. I am aware of precisely how this began, Lady Priscilla, Eugenia said evenly. Are you? Priscilla's smile widened. How refreshing for someone to admit it so plainly. I do wonder how convincingly that awareness will hold once the season ends and the practicalities of your situation become rather less interesting to him than they currently are. She departed with a final, glittering look, and Eugenia stood very still beside the pianoforte, breathing carefully, until Nathaniel appeared at her side moments later, his jaw tight with visible anger. Ignore every word of that. She is not entirely wrong, Eugenia said quietly. This did begin as a transaction. I've known that from the very first morning. It began as a transaction, he agreed. It has not continued as one. I would like you to believe that, Eugenia, though I understand you have very little reason to, given how this started. Eugenia did not answer. She was not yet certain she trusted the difference he was describing, however much she wanted to. You have gone very quiet since the musicale, Eugenia's own mother observed during a visit the following afternoon, setting down her teacup with the particular attentiveness she reserved for matters she considered important. Lady Priscilla said some things, Eugenia admitted. I have been turning them over. What sort of things? That I am simply a convenient solution to an inconvenient problem, that he will return to sense once the practicalities of my situation become less interesting to him than they currently are. Eugenia stared at her own hands. She may not be entirely wrong, Mother. This began because of Father's debts. A transaction. I do not know how much of what has happened since is genuine, and how much is simply two people convincing themselves of something because the alternative is too uncomfortable to examine. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. I have watched you change in the week since this began, she said finally. You used to recite figures with grim determination, as though reciting a sentence rather than a fact. Now I have watched you laugh about ledger errors, Eugenia. I have watched a duke send round particular books because you mentioned once that you enjoyed a certain author. Whatever Lady Priscilla believes about convenience, I have never once seen a man behave like someone managing an inconvenient obligation. You believe it is real, then? I believe, her mother said, that you have spent your whole life being too practical to trust good fortune when it finally arrives. Do not let one bitter woman convince you to distrust the one good thing your father's collapse accidentally produced. She found him in the library 2 nights later, the household quiet, a single lamp burning low. I have been thinking about what Priscilla said, Eugenia admitted, settling into the chair across from him. So have I. He closed the ledger he had not been reading. I should be honest with you, since honesty was the one condition you insisted upon from the very first morning, and I've not entirely honored it these past few weeks. Eugenia waited. This stopped being a transaction for me somewhere around the 2nd week, he said. I told myself otherwise. I told myself I was simply enjoying clever company during an inconvenient arrangement. But I find I've stopped being able to maintain that fiction, even to myself. Somewhere between the trade tariffs and the estate ledgers, and the morning you corrected my steward's arithmetic without being asked. Eugenia's breath caught. I love you, he said plainly, not because of the arrangement or the convenience or the fact that we have spent 3 months playing house rather effectively, because you read at breakfast and argue with me about trade policy and have never once performed for me the way every other woman in London performs for my title. I do not know precisely when it happened. I only know it has happened entirely. And I find I'm no longer interested in the 3 months ending as planned. You cannot possibly mean that, Eugenia said, her eyes bright. We barely knew each other when this began. We have spent 3 months having conversations deeper than most married couples manage in a lifetime, he said. I know how you take your tea. I know you read account ledgers for amusement and are hopeless at embroidery and laugh at things considerably drier than most people find funny. I know you are afraid that if you allow this to become real, you will never know whether I chose you or simply chose convenience. I am telling you plainly that I am choosing you, specifically, apart from any arrangement my mother engineered. My family's situation is still precarious, Eugenia said. even with your assistance. If I marry you for real, there will always be people who say I trapped you, or that I married you for your fortune rather than genuine feeling." "Let them say it," Nathaniel said. "I do not particularly care. I am a duke who argues publicly for factory reform and has been called considerably worse than a man who married for love rather than connections. One more controversy will not undo me, especially when it comes attached to the most interesting woman I've ever met." "Yes," Eugenia said. "Yes, what?" "Yes to all of it, the real version. No more pretending, no more arrangement, simply us, building something honest, the way you once said you wanted." He crossed the small distance between them and kissed her with a gentleness that told her everything Priscilla's cruelty had gotten wrong. And outside the library windows, the London night settled quietly around Silverbrook House. They married in early autumn, the wedding considerably more genuine than the engagement that had preceded it, and the Dowager Duchess accepted every congratulation on the success of her scheme with a serenity that bordered on smugness. "You manipulated us both into an engagement neither of us agreed to," Eugenia told her during the wedding breakfast, with more affection than accusation. "I introduced two sensible people to an opportunity neither of you would have pursued on your own initiative," the Dowager said. "The method was unconventional. The result, I think, speaks for itself." Lady Priscilla Faulkner sent a card of cool congratulation and married a baron in Hampshire by the following spring, and was rarely mentioned at Silverbrook House again. 6 years later, the library at Silverbrook House holds, on a quiet autumn evening, a fire burning steadily, 3 children variously occupied across the room, and considerably more chaos than either Nathaniel or Eugenia anticipated when they married. "Mama, the figures do not balance," announces their eldest, 8-year-old William, looking up from a small ledger his mother has been teaching him to read since he was old enough to hold a pen steady. "Show me," Eugenia says, and William brings the page over with the same serious concentration his father brings to Parliament. "He gets that focus from you," Nathaniel says, watching the exchange from his desk. "He gets the ledgers from both of us," Eugenia says, "though I notice you have never once corrected his arithmetic yourself. You leave that entirely to me." "I leave it to you because you do it considerably better," Nathaniel says. "I learned that lesson rather thoroughly during our engagement." Their second child, 5-year-old Margaret, abandons her own drawing to climb onto her father's lap uninvited, declaring with great seriousness that William's ledger is boring and that she would rather hear about Parliament instead. "Parliament is also rather boring on most days," Nathaniel tells her. "Then tell me the boring parts," Margaret says, with the particular logic of a 5-year-old entirely confident in her own reasoning, and Nathaniel, against his own better judgment, begins explaining the trade tariff debate in terms simple enough for a 5-year-old to follow, while Eugenia watches with quiet amusement from across the room. Eugenia's own mother, who has come to live nearby since Lord Wexford's death 3 years past, arrives shortly after for her customary Thursday visit, embracing each grandchild in turn before settling into her usual chair. "He is teaching her about tariffs," Eugenia's mother observes, with the same disbelief she has expressed at this particular habit for several years running. "She asked," Nathaniel says, by way of defense. "She is 5. "She is remarkably perceptive for 5, Nathaniel says. I find I cannot in good conscience deny a perceptive child information simply because of her age. The Dowager Duchess, considerably greyer now but no less formidable, arrives shortly after, settling into her usual chair with the easy confidence of a woman who engineered this entire happy chaos through sheer force of will and has never once regretted the methods required. "I hear William has found another error in the household accounts," she says. "He takes after his mother rather more than his title would suggest." "He takes after both of us," Eugenia says, "which I've come to think is the better outcome regardless. I told you, the very first afternoon, that you were the most sensible young woman I had encountered in a decade," the Dowager says to Eugenia. "I do not believe I've ever been more correct about anything in my considerable life." "You rarely are wrong, Your Grace," Eugenia says. "It remains the most exhausting thing about this family." "It is the only reason any of you are happy," the Dowager says, entirely unbothered, and reaches for her youngest grandchild, 2-year-old Charlotte, who toddles over with the easy confidence of a child who has never once doubted she would be caught. Nathaniel crosses the room and sits beside Eugenia, taking her hand the way he has every evening for 6 years, and watches his children fill the library with noise his own childhood never once contained. "Do you remember," he says, "that my mother announced our engagement before I had even met you?" "I remember," Eugenia says. "I believe I called it a disaster, rather emphatically within the first hour." "You are not entirely wrong," he says. "It was a disaster. It simply turned out to be the best one either of us ever survived." She leans her head against his shoulder, and William returns to his ledger with renewed determination, and the library that once held 2 strangers, forced together by an unwanted announcement, now holds, instead, an entire small and well-loved family, exactly where his mother always intended them to be. The end. Dear listener, perhaps you have spent years believing that love had to arrive in a particular order to count. Attraction first, then courtship, then commitment, each step earned in its proper sequence before the next was permitted to begin. Eugenia did not choose her own beginning. It was handed to her, without her consent, by a meddling mother-in-law, who decided, long before either of them agreed to anything, that 2 sensible people deserved a chance neither of them would have pursued alone. The arrangement was awkward. It began in desperation and obligation, not romance, and it became, despite every reasonable objection either of them raised, the truest love either of them ever found. So many of us distrust the unconventional paths our own lives have taken. We believe that if love did not arrive through the proper channels, courtship, then affection, then commitment, each in its tidy place, it somehow does not count as fully ours. We hold our own complicated beginnings against ourselves, as though the manner of arrival determines the value of what eventually grew. But love rarely consults our preferred timeline. Sometimes it arrives through circumstance, obligation, or someone else's well-meaning interference, and reveals itself slowly, breakfast by breakfast, ledger by ledger, until one day you realize you have stopped performing entirely and started simply living together honestly. If you are 40 or 50 or further along, and your own story began in a way you did not choose or could not have planned, know that the beginning was never the measure of what it could become. What matters is not how the door opened, What matters is who walked through it and what you built together once you finally stopped pretending. Tonight, as you rest, let yourself release any shame about your own unconventional beginnings. Sleep well, dear friend. It is never too late for an unplanned start to become the truest chapter of your life. With love. From all of us at Fables of Love. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. If it made you laugh, cry, or believe in love all over again, we would be so grateful if you liked this video, left a comment, and subscribed to the channel. Sharing it with someone who loves historical romance means the world to us and keeps our storytelling corner alive. Another story is waiting for you at the end of this video. Click, listen, and let your heart be swept away once more. From all of us at Fables of Love, thank you for being here.